Okay, well, thanks so much, Peter. I was really pleased that you invited me to come and talk to our colleagues in the Emeriti group. And I'm actually not in San Diego right now. I'm probably some others of you are also not in San Diego, but are closer to grandchildren, which is where I am. I'm in Brooklyn. And but it's a great pleasure and honor to speak to the Emeriti group about my new book, which I am an old China hand. I've been working on China for a very long time. I first went to China in 1971 and started studying China about 5 or 6 years before then. And for most of the time that I've been studying China for more than 50 years, China's been moving basically in a positive direction. People's lives in China have been improving. China's relations with other countries, including the United States, have been getting better, despite the vast differences in our political system and the fact that China was growing more powerful. It was a rising power and therefore a potential challenger to the United States as the incumbent superpower. But nevertheless, Chinese leaders pursued a strategy of self-restraint in their foreign policy, and which was designed to reassure Americans and people in other countries as well that it wasn't a threat, despite its growing power, because it had benign intentions. So this, and of course, from the standpoint of the United States, we really, in some ways, we sponsored China's rise as an international player, gave it a seat at the table, invited it to every multilateral organization, and China really embraced those opportunities. So I'd say there were ups and downs. We had Tiananmen in 1989, but by and large, the path of China's rise was peaceful and things were going along pretty well. Then in the mid-2000s, and this is even before the global financial crisis, we saw that China's behavior changed. Internationally, we saw a more assertive China in the South China Sea. This was really a very important sign of some change in China's behavior. It started shoving around other Southeast Asian countries who claim part of the South China Sea, including the rocks there, and they have coastal waters that, according to international law, they have important rights in those coastal waters. But China, not so much its military, but its civilian maritime ships and planes, started pushing around these other claimants, interfering with their fishing, their drilling, and even interfering with the United States when it sent, because we view the South China Sea as international waters, as most countries do, and they started picking fights even with American naval surveillance vessels. So this really was quite a shock to me, because previously the South China Sea had not been the focal point of China's domestic nationalism. You don't find much mention in the media. And so I was puzzled, where did this come from? At about the same time, I saw changes in domestic policy as well. Before the Olympics, there was a marked tightening up of controls over society and media and internet, which really had become remarkably open in the early years of the 21st century. We had investigative reporting, we had a lot of debates on Weibo and social media, but there was a tightening up before the 2008 Olympics. And at the time, I thought, okay, in China, things often tighten up right before a big event because they don't want any surprises. But then afterwards, they loosen up and go back to normal. But in this case, there was no loosening up. And in fact, there hasn't been loosening up ever since. So this was the puzzle that really motivated me to start the research on this book, because this was a period when China was being ruled by a relatively weak leader named Hu Jintao and a collective leadership. There were 9 people in the standing committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Each one of them was assigned a responsibility over part of governance and was responsible for particular bureaucracies. But puzzlingly, this type of collective leadership didn't seem to lead to restraint. It was leading to what I call overreach. And of course, the definition of overreach is to take things too far, do them in an exaggerated way, in a manner that actually is harmful to yourself, snaps back to be costly to yourself. So I saw the beginnings of overreach, and this is really, I think, one of the big surprises that you see in my book, is that overreach did not begin with this more dictatorial leader, Xi Jinping. It became even earlier, it started even earlier under this more oligarchic rule, collective leadership. Because Deng Xiaoping, who took over the leadership of China after Mao died in the late 70s, he established a lot of new norms and rules, some of them written, some of them unwritten, about how the Chinese Communist Party and government should operate. And the goal was to prevent the tragic overreaching of Mao Zedong, who, because of what Deng Xiaoping called the over-concentration of power in the hands of one man, you got arbitrary decisions which were very tragically costly for China, like the Great Leap Forward in the 1950s that led to a massive famine, and of course, the Cultural Revolution. So Deng encouraged the Chinese Communist Party to rule by this collective leadership with retirement ages and term limits, and the collective institutions of the party meeting more frequently and regularly in order to make political competition more predictable and regular, make the regime more responsive to people's needs as China was modernizing with a market economy and being open to the world. And to lead, part of that package of institutionalizing collective leadership was also a restrained foreign policy. But surprisingly, collective leadership under Hu Jintao did not operate that way. And so I have quite a long and somewhat detailed explanation of how that happened, which I'm not going to get into right now because I think people are more interested in what is happening today. But if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to go back to that. But as Hu Jintao's 2 terms in office ended, the collective leadership had also become very, very corrupt. And there were also different voices at the top. And in fact, on the eve of Xi Jinping's ascension to power, there was an open split in the leadership as Bo Xilai, the party secretary of Chongqing, was caught. His wife was accused of murdering a foreigner, and his play for power blew up. So Xi Jinping comes in, and he had a mandate from the other party leaders to establish a more stronger core leadership, a stronger centralized leadership. They shrunk the size of the standing committee, and he was really authorized by the others to take a stronger hand. But nobody imagined that he would be ruling the way he has ruled for the last 10 years. He really, frankly, he's pulled the wool over the eyes of the other Chinese leaders. He talked like a big market reformer, and his career had been in the coastal provinces that are known for being economically and culturally more open to the rest of the world and more open to the private business sector. But once he came into office, the first thing he did, after taking control of the military, he introduced a massive anti-corruption campaign, which also was a purge of all the potential rivals to Xi Jinping, real and imagined. And this purge by now, and it continues up to this very day, has investigated and penalized up to 5 million party and government officials and some very high-level officials. It has become what Zbigniew Brzezinski once called, in speaking about the Soviet Union, now it's a permanent purge, because we see the latest round of investigations and punishments going to the investigators, the people in the discipline commission and in the internal police, who were once so trusted. They were the inquisitors in the earlier rounds of purge. And now 2 of the very senior leaders of this part of the internal police apparatus have been convicted of given death sentences, suspended death sentences. So they will be in prison for the rest of their lives. And they have been publicly accused not just of massive corruption, but also openly accused of plotting against the party and the leader. So, well, what are the consequences of this purge? The consequences are that Xi Jinping is completely fixated on loyalty. You know, that's what he cares about much more than competence. And so the subordinate officials know that it's necessary for them to preserve their own career opportunities, and indeed their security and that of their families, to somehow prove their loyalty to Xi Jinping. And they do that by trying to figure out where he's headed in policy terms, both in foreign policy and domestic policy. Then they jump on the bandwagon to try to get there first, to be noticed and to be praised for being the most loyal to Xi Jinping. But it also means that they carry out Xi's policies to an extreme, maybe to a greater extreme than Xi Jinping himself may have wanted. And finally, none of them dare tell him the actual costs of his policies to the interests and welfare of China. So this is the dynamic that I identify as driving Overreach under this more concentrated leadership system. So it's interesting that we had the beginnings of Overreach under collective leadership, but now we have a very different type of regime. And in fact, the Overreach is even more extreme, even more acute. And you can see it in the last year, even, of Xi Jinping's 2 terms in office. Of course, we'll talk in a minute about the recent party congress, which initiated his 3rd term. But there are so many examples of overreach in foreign policy and domestic policy. In foreign policy, the aggressiveness in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, where there are also territorial disputes with Japan, have really intensified. Of course, we have the artificial islands in the South China Sea, which Xi Jinping promised President Obama not to militarize, but he has gone back on that promise and militarized them with runways and deployments of planes and ships and radar and that sort of thing. During the also intensified pressure on Taiwan, the Chinese military flying across the midline in the Taiwan Strait, even before Speaker Pelosi went to visit Taiwan, that had been going on for more than a year. And picking a fight with India at the border that had more casualties than any of border skirmish had in many, many years, putting economic pressure on Australia, on Korea, on European countries like Lithuania, that because the party leadership objected to the way they talked about Taiwan or Xinjiang or Tibet, or issues that are essentially domestic political issues in China. People have to hew to the Chinese Communist Party line on these issues. If they don't, if they differ, then the Chinese government will impose some form of economic sanctions on you. And we see this with companies too, airlines that mentioned by mistake called Taiwan a country or things like that. In the case of Australia, trade with Australia was almost entirely cut off, except for iron ore, which China depends on Australia for, because the Australian government called for an international investigation of the origins of COVID. So these kinds of actions, many of them occurring, for example, just in the first year of the Biden administration, when you might have expected that it would be a good time for the Chinese leadership to try to reassure the new administration, try to stabilize relations with the United States, because a stable relationship with the United States is very much a core interest of China, or should be viewed as a core interest, I would say. But instead, we had these provocative actions. And domestically, we had the crackdown in the private sector at the end of 2021, which, like bolts from the blue, is the way I describe them in the book. They suddenly stopped Ant Financial, part of Alibaba, just a day or two before it was about to be listed. And they stopped its IPO. The regulators, there were a number of things that they objected to, but it was a very herky-jerky, abrupt kind of crackdown on the private sector that resulted in a tremendous loss of value to the investors and to the company itself, but also has devastated China's private businesses, which are an important source of jobs. Now we have a problem of youth unemployment in China that we haven't had in years because of this, as well as the zero COVID policy. But it's not just zero COVID policy. The crackdown on the private sector has really been costly to the Chinese economy. And many business entrepreneurs, executives are trying to figure out a way to liquidate their holdings and leave China. This is right out of Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. I mean, they are exiting. And even before that move in 2021, the pressure on the private sector has been quite intense. It's been quite clear that from Xi Jinping's perspective, he has a strong preference for state-owned enterprises, a more heavy-handed role of state agencies in managing the economy, and he's focused on security, loyalty, and he expects all business people to find ways of showing their loyalty to him. So from the standpoint of the business folk, they watch what's happening and they feel that they're getting expropriated through policy and regulation. And they can't predict what might happen next. The third term itself, Xi Jinping's move to change the state constitution to allow him to stay on as president, which is one of his three jobs at the top. That in and of itself, and the fact that there was so little resistance to it, that there was no sign of resistance, really shocked a lot of business people who felt that that was a very bad sign about what could happen to them. So, and then of course, zero COVID, which at one time might have been seen as, certainly a very successful management of the epidemic compared to the early days of the United States and some other countries, but sticking to it even as the disease became more contagious but less lethal was clearly a form of overreach, because Xi Jinping had claimed that China's management of COVID showed that it was a superior political system, a superior form of governance. And he persisted in this even after it didn't make sense anymore, and has really had a hard time adjusting, making the transition to a form of managing the disease, which would be less devastating to Chinese economic growth. So, I do believe that the other, especially other politicians in the party, and I did a lot of interviewing for my book, which helped me gain an understanding of how they viewed collective leadership and Xi Jinping's over-concentration of power. And now I'm quite sure, even though I haven't had a chance to do much interviewing during the COVID period, I've done some, and I'm pretty sure that many of these folks at the top of the party are very frustrated and dissatisfied with Xi Jinping, because what we see, and this came through very clearly at the 20th Party Congress, not just a leader who's changing the rules and norms to have a third term, but also has now surrounded himself with loyalists, with his cronies, and he changed the retirement age rules in order to get rid of a number of senior leaders who'd been at the top, who had strong independent reputations and might have questioned Xi Jinping's decisions, and led to a more pragmatic approach of managing the economy as well as other foreign policy. And he got rid of them, so he would have more slots to fill with his loyalists. And even those people, very sophisticated Chinese, who knew the third term was coming, have been shocked by the outcome of the 20th Party Congress, and are really, quite frankly, freaked out by the situation and very worried about what it means for the future. So my book tries to open up the black box of Chinese domestic politics and policy making to help us understand why China has been overreaching in this manner over the past 15 years. And it's not really a policy book, but the last chapter does offer recommendations to the Chinese side and to American policymakers. And I'm really happy to talk about that, but maybe it would be good to do that in the question and answer session. Or do you want me to talk about it now? I don't hear you, Peter. You're muted. Peter, you're muted.
I know. Now I'm unmuted. That was great, Susan. Let me start it out and give people a moment to catch their breath and think of some questions. I wanted to ask you whether these sounds like one reads all the time that the people are frustrated and upset. What can they do about it? It doesn't in the Chinese system. It sounds like a system that doesn't give them much opportunity for voice. And so if you're inside China and you're upset, what can you do?
Well, I mean, let's break down that question into two
Just let me say to everybody, if you've got questions, please remember to use the raised hand command. The thing I see already that Suresh has got a question, so you're first in line. So use that command, and you can also use the chat command, and I can see that Gail Liu has one. But use those mechanisms, and that helps things out. Okay, Susan, please go ahead.
Well, I like to think about that question at two levels. At the mass level, at the general public. Our surveys that we do at China Data Lab of 21st Century China Center and that other people have done indicate that actually Xi Jinping has been quite popular up until, but that may be changing a bit as zero COVID continues and people are extremely fed up with that. And our latest surveys that just came in, we're analyzing now, show that people definitely favor some adjustments in the management of COVID. But Xi Jinping, was the man on the white horse, cleaning up corruption. He tries to make himself appear to be a man of the people. He was sent down during the Cultural Revolution to the countryside and talks a lot about how that, even though he's a princeling, he's the son of a Long March cadre, one of Deng Xiaoping and Mao's colleagues, who was very respected, became a reformer together with Deng Xiaoping. So that's why nobody thought, and was a victim of the Cultural Revolution. So that's why nobody thought Xi Jinping would kind of transform himself into a Mao-like leader. So at the public level, I don't think he has much to worry about. I don't see that China's on the brink. It's not a volcano about to erupt or anything like that. I don't see, but of course, we don't know what will happen if the economy grows much slower and people, real estate holdings, diminish in value. But right now, he's pretty solid with the public. The real risk to him, I believe, is at the top. And as you know, most authoritarian regimes are toppled top down, not bottom up. And I do think that a Leninist leader who does not give any power sharing is bound to frustrate the other leaders. and of course, they also don't recognize how costly Xi's decisions have been to China. But they are surveilled very closely. They are, there are rules about they're not allowed to, not supposed to communicate with one another. So colluding together to intervene with Xi Jinping, either to launch something like a coup or to simply intervene and try to get him to share more power, to have more collective decision-making, is very difficult to do.
Yeah.
But there are also all these, and then of course, there are all these people in jail. But remember, the families of all those people in jail, they must really hate Xi Jinping. So they're, potential opposition. Then also the people who were just kicked out of the standing committee, retired, but of course they will be watched very closely. So yeah, repression can protect Xi for a long time,
Yeah.
but I don't think they can do it forever. The way I think about this to myself is I can't tell you what will happen, but when it happens, I won't be surprised.
Okay, well, let me pick on Suresh, who has his hand up, and then I have several questions from the chat, and I'll look for more hand raising.
I see Natasha.
But Natasha, you have to learn to use the command. Okay, I will now ask you, but Natasha, please learn to go to the reactions down there and learn how to raise your hand. But I'll pick on Suresh next, and I'll put you on the list.
I thought I
Okay.
was doing it
Thank
wrong
you, Susan.
by doing this.
No, you've picked but I've got you on the list now. I've got you on the list. You can wait your turn.
I want to follow up.
Wait your turn, Natasha, it's not your turn.
Oh, okay.
Not your turn. Suresh's turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for a wonderful introduction and a fascinating topic. So I had a question. In the next 5 years, do you anticipate any move against Taiwan, and is Quad and the U.S. involvement give you confidence that it's a good neutralization of China's interest in Taiwan?
I didn't understand the second part.
Is Quad and the U.S. involvement sufficient to neutralize, keep China in check with respect to their interests in Taiwan?
Well, it's certainly the case, Suresh, that I am less confident that the Taiwan Strait will remain peaceful over the next 5 years than I had been previously. I've been part of many simulations, policy simulations of Taiwan crises. And we always end up discovering that China is very much self-deterred from attacking Taiwan. But in the case of Xi Jinping, because he has been imprudent in so many other dimensions, I really am less certain that he will be as prudent as previous leaders have been. And we are in the process of strengthening our deterrence posture to help Taiwan defend itself and discourage China from attacking Taiwan. Because if a Chinese leader attacks Taiwan and fails,
yes,
then it is widely believed in China, this may be a myth, but everybody believes it, that the people would rise up and bring him down. And maybe even bring down the party if it failed
Yeah.
at a military attack. So the Quad is one thing. Even more important is really, I think specifically the Japanese now have taken the position, the Japanese government, that Taiwan is a critical factor in its own national security. And that gives it the legal authorization to act with the United States and help support the United States, which will then help support Taiwan in defending itself. So I think the deterrence work is going pretty well, but there's still more to be done. And of course, this is a scenario that is right in China's backyard. Whereas for the United States, we're on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. So it's not an easy military defense.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Susan, I've got a question from the chat, which follows on Taiwan. What's the relationship with Hong Kong these days? China with Hong Kong. What comment would you
Well,
make?
Hong Kong, one of the examples of Xi Jinping's overreach is the way he handled the protest activity in Taiwan and imposed this new national security law, which has really transformed Hong Kong, transformed Hong Kong. We now have a PRC security agency based in Hong Kong. So all the promises about allowing 50 years of autonomy that Beijing made back in 1997 have been broken, basically. And you have the school curriculum being changed in Hong Kong to have a lot more patriotic education oriented toward the mainland. You have people, the Democrats, you have to prove you're a patriot to run for local office in Hong Kong. And the jails in Hong Kong have a lot of people who were pro-democracy in Hong Kong. They're now in jail. So really, and many of the international financial institutions that once had their Asia bases in Hong Kong are moving to Singapore or even sometimes to Seoul. So basically, Beijing has taken over Hong Kong.
Jake Jacoby.
Thank you, and I appreciate your comments and your insight. So very recently, President Biden espoused I think it's $52 billion to give to American computer chip companies to start building and generating the chip industry here and taking it away from the risk that would occur if China did get involved with a military situation with Taiwan. What would your impression be if, in fact, the U.S. could divert, say, 50% of the chip making from China to the U.S. or to Europe or the West? How would that impact the satisfaction of the Chinese, and what impact would it have on their growth?
Well, the science and technology and these emerging technologies have become the focal point of the intense competition between the United States and China. It's not so much that we're dependent on China for the production of advanced chips. We're dependent on Taiwan and Taiwan Semiconductor, not so much China. And of course, the designs for the chip come from Qualcomm and other American companies. What America doesn't have is the fabs, these very expensive facilities to produce the chips. So we are dependent on other countries. China is very dependent on the outside world. They cannot design and produce their own advanced chips yet. And what we are really trying to do is to make sure they don't get that capability. We are sanctioning, restricting not just American companies, but any international company that has American technology as in it, from selling equipment to China to produce advanced semiconductors and to sell advanced chips to China. So this is a huge blow to the Chinese economy. And I mean, it's also a blow to ourselves, our own companies, and to companies in other countries. But to China, they see this as an extremely hostile act, which it is. And I talk with people in the administration, people in government, and our intention is very much to impede the development of this capability in China, because we see that it also facilitates their military capabilities. The main justification for it from our side is it's a dual use technology with a lot of military uses. So I co-chaired a task force and a working group within the task force. Peter Cowie was involved in it, about the tech competition between the US and China. And in most domains, we favor greater openness, and we oppose the decoupling, which US government has been carrying out through its sanctions and regulations, restrictions. But when it comes to these advanced semiconductors, that is one area that we support carving out and preventing China from getting the capability to make it themselves.
Susan, what would you say? That Christine Connerfeld has a question in the chat about financial flows and financial markets. What would you say about that and the two countries and their interactions? What's the leverage that each has over the other, and how does that play around? And do the rules make any difference, or do they have a lot of leverage over each other? What would you say about that?
Well, I mean, the two economies have become highly interdependent. And if you look at the trajectory of economic globalization over the past 4 decades. Really, at the hub of it, much of it, is the US-China relationship. And then all the spillovers to other countries. And and yet, the Biden administration is now actively talking about capital controls on American investment in China. We already have restrictions. We have a blacklist that the Pentagon put out of companies that are dual use or military affiliated that Americans are not allowed to invest in. And there's talk about expanding this to more, especially technology domains, capital controls on American investment, which is an extremely radical thing to do. America has not done that certainly with a country with whom we are not formally at war forever, I don't think. And I see this as a form of overreaction. You know, in that last chapter, I was
On our
talking
part?
about, I see this, China's overreaching, and I believe that US policy is overreacting to the threat in a way that will be harmful to ourselves and our own competitiveness, and really to the whole global economy.
Okay. Natasha, your turn. You had a question. Unmute yourself.
Susan, could you talk about China's investments in Africa?
Mhm.
What they are planning, what their purposes are, how successful they have been? I'd like you to address that if you could.
Thank you, Natasha. Good to see you. You know, Africa has been, in recent decades, a pretty neglected continent. And the attention of China actually has been welcomed by many African countries, because especially when they first started investing in Africa, foreign investments in Africa, they built a lot of infrastructure that started connecting African countries to one another. And they hadn't been connected to one another by trains or roads very much. So it ended up actually being a good economic boost to many African countries. But many of the projects where China is making loans to African countries, the terms of the loans are secret. They're not transparent. And when the recipient country is feeling the economic pinch, they and oftentimes they have loans from other, like World Bank or other sources as well. The question of, you know, who do they pay back first, or when they can't pay back, is there loan forgiveness? So, and in countries that are democratic and have elections, by and large, and in fact, this might be a rule, it might be true in every single democratic country, electoral democracy, where China's economic role has grown in recent years, the Chinese presence becomes very controversial And the challengers criticize the incumbent government for being too cozy with the Chinese and being taken advantage of by the Chinese. And we see this just recently in Kenya, where the Kenyan government is now actually unilaterally releasing information about the terms of the contract because there's been so much controversy over the loans from China. So, you know, in the US government, and especially in the Trump administration, they went around to Africa trying to encourage African countries to push back against China. But actually, we don't need to do that because there's a backlash growing in many of these countries, even though they feel that they benefited in some ways from the Chinese presence. But, and this is true for the whole Belt and Road initiative, there's quite a bit of backlash that naturally occurs.
Susan, Sandy Lakoff has a question for you, which is, what can the U.S. and other countries do to persuade Xi Jinping to be more cooperative in reducing emissions, especially with respect to China's continued building of coal-fired power plants?
Well, of course, we did have success in the Obama administration. And we, right now, the Xi Jinping government has broken off discussions about climate because they objected to the visit of Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan. They often treat cooperation on climate as a favor to us instead of something kind of a bargaining chip, instead of something that's in their own interest. And yet, in many ways, Chinese environmental policy has been, you know, they've really done a lot, actually, to move to renewables. They haven't completely cut off the building of coal power plants, especially overseas in these Belt and Road countries. You know, I mean, there's not that much the United States could do. The world can put pressure on China not to build more coal plants overseas. We can shame China and put pressure on China about that. But let's see what happens at the COP meeting that's occurring right now, where which side will China be on? You know, will it stand with the developing countries, and will the developing countries uncritically embrace China against the advanced industrial countries in the West? Or will China stand more with Europe and other countries? I mean, you know, Chinese relations with Europe have really deteriorated, in large part recently because of their standing with Russia in their war in Ukraine. Although they haven't provided any tangible assistance militarily, they have provided kind of moral support to Russia. So, you know, climate, I think, has become intertwined with geopolitics, much to the detriment of progress on this critically important area.
Suzanne Chaffee asks you whether you've read the novel 2034, The Next World War by General Stavridis, which describes how China, America, Taiwan tensions ramp up to. Is this the kind of horrifying scenario that you've studied? The answer is no.
I mean, it's we have a lot of China scare books around.
Yeah.
I mean, my analysis of China is pretty critical, very critical. But I hope people don't just consider it a China scare book.
What could you say something more about that? Because I think that's an interesting question. How do you draw a balance between writing things which are analytic and saying things which then are offensive to them, they find offensive, and which start to make you persona non grata, which then makes it difficult for you to study them because they don't want you around anymore. I mean, that struck me that always was a problem with people who studied, Russia in the old days, the old Soviet Russia or China, that if you're critical, they get mad at you and won't let you come back.
Well, I hope that won't be the case. Let me just put it that way. I wrote the book actually and what was in my mind was I wanted it to be a book that Chinese people could read and learn from and think about how China could rise peacefully.
Yeah.
It can pursue its ambitions in a manner that is welcomed by other countries, including the United States.
Yeah.
So, and I dedicated the book to my friends and colleagues, my Chinese friends and colleagues, who have taught me a lot about their country. So it's very important to me that Chinese people see that I don't have some generalized hostility toward China. I think that this overreach can be fixed. It can be moderated. China is behaving the way it is today. None of this is inevitable. This can be addressed through human agency and through good diplomacy on the part of the United States, why
don't you say more about that? There are lots of people, and we live in a country where the blame game is very common, and all countries have this. People are going to say, that blame game goes on with Russia all the time. This literature that what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, it's all the Americans' fault because we provoked it. I mean, I happen to think that's a very foolish argument that the United States provoked it. I think we appeased the heck out of Putin and let him have everything he wanted. And so he decided, well, they're not telling me I can't have it. I want more. So say something about, we're not here about Putin today. We're here to talk about China. What can the United States do? Are there things the United States could do? Will you describe this process that took place over a 20, 30-year period where he started to centralize more and more power? Anything the United States could have done about that? Is that internal processes to China over which we have, let's face it, are we being arrogant to think that is blame game an arrogant attitude on our part that we actually think that we could have done something about it?
Well, I think it's an important point to make that the shift to more overreach in the mid-2000s under Hu Jintao was not in response to some change in US policy. Okay, this was really very much internally driven.
That's a
we
big
don't see any change in US policy at that time. The Obama administration was actually trying to sustain engagement with China. Today, I feel that we have overreacted to the China threat first of all, are perceiving China as a greater threat is in large part due to China's own behavior and actions. But but for 6 years, we have not attempted to use diplomacy to see whether or not that pragmatic gene that previous Chinese leaders had still resides inside Xi Jinping. We haven't really tested whether or not we could encourage him to moderate his policies. Not all things. I mean, smart diplomacy means not taking on issues that will be futile. So, and I think Hong Kong and Xinjiang, frankly, there's very little the outside world can do about that. These are domestic issues for China, and very hard for us to influence them. But in terms of foreign policy behavior, I think there's more we can do. And I think we could do more in terms of economic policy and trade and investment policy as well. So I'm hoping that the meeting, which I expect to occur between President Biden and President Xi in Indonesia in a couple of weeks as part of the G20, the first face-to-face meeting between these leaders in 3 years, will be very important and will provide an opportunity to test whether or not there's any flexibility on the Chinese side.
Great. Jake, I can't tell whether your hand is up or not. Is your hand up?
Yes, it is, sir.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So what
I thought you had never put it down from before. My apologies. Go ahead.
Okay, I did put it down. I just raised it a little bit ago because
Sorry.
so I have a lifelong friend who's an architect who's lived in Miami and branches in New York, and he does a lot of international building in Central America. But when he goes into South America, he tells me, and we just had this discussion like 3 weeks ago, that the Chinese are everywhere. They're in all over South America, building roads, economic development, building houses, agricultural projects, and support to the military, particularly in Venezuela. And clearly, when we look at although we're not talking about Putin, but when we look at what Putin tries to do in Europe, dominate through pressuring the people so that they get restless and resent the fact that their oil is being cut off. The Chinese are in fact doing the same thing all over South America, and I would view that as a way to get more people to side with China in their battle with, or in their long-term confrontation with Taiwan and the U.S. What insights do you have about how America could actually, since South America is closer to the U.S. than it is to China, are we missing the boat in being able to counter China by investing and developing South America?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult for the United States and Western countries to throw the amounts of money that China is prepared to throw into its foreign loans and investment. And we are starting to pay more attention and try to compete in this domain. But most of what we're talking about is pretty small potatoes compared to what China has been doing. Now, China is cutting back some of these overseas aid and loans too, because for one thing, it's not popular in China at all. For the same reason that in America, people complain that our foreign aid is too much, let's help people at home. That's the same attitude you'll find in China. And also, China doesn't actually just dig into its treasury to extend loans to these countries. What they do is they go borrow money and then reloan it to these other countries. So they, their economy is, feeling the pinch. And so they are winding down a lot of projects, and, the Belt and Road especially was a Xi Jinping, they call in China kind of a vanity project. This was his personal pride and part of the cult of personality, actually. So what we see is it's being carried out now in a more modest and realistic manner. And all of that is happening automatically, not as a result of US putting pressure or anything.
Okay, well, Susan, I want to thank you. That's our 5 o'clock witching hour here and 8 o'clock where you are. And thank you for a terrific session. It was a lot of fun, very interesting. Everybody, the book is out there. I know it's on Amazon and other sources that you can get. It's a very interesting book, and I recommend it to all of you as a very stimulating read. So thanks a whole lot, Susan. It was very interesting for all of us.
It was great. I really enjoyed talking to the hometown crowd here, and please read the book and send me a note and let me know what you found interesting and what you disagree with.
This gets posted, by the way. It gets posted on UCSD TV. There's a special network, and it's not just the Emeriti who watch it. It's all kinds of people join this and get to see it and get posted. So, okay, take care. Good night.
Right, bye-bye. Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.